The airplane hummed softly as passengers settled into their seats, the usual pre-flight energy buzzing through the cabin. Among them was a young boy, Ethan, barely 8 years old, sitting wide-eyed by the window, his small hands gripping the armrest in excitement. His mother, Olivia, smiled warmly at him, answering his endless stream of questions with patience and love. This was his first flight, a long-awaited vacation she had been saving up for, and she wanted it to be special. Ethan leaned forward, peering curiously into the aisle, eager to catch a glimpse of the bustling flight attendants preparing for takeoff. His mother gently reminded him to sit back, but his excitement was infectious, his innocent wonder lighting up the space around him. That moment of joy, however, was shattered in an instant. A flight attendant, Teresa, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, stormed down the aisle with a rigid posture that spoke of someone who had long since lost the warmth for her job. She stopped abruptly in front of them, her uniform crisp but her expression tight with irritation. "Sit back properly, young man," she snapped, her voice slicing through the gentle murmur of passengers settling in. "This isn't a playground." The words struck like a slap. Ethan's face fell, his joyful curiosity replaced with confusion and a creeping sense of embarrassment. Olivia, caught off guard by the harshness in the woman's tone, immediately placed a reassuring hand on her son's shoulder. "I'm sorry," Olivia said, forcing a calm but firm tone. "He's just excited. It's his first time flying." Teresa, however, wasn't interested in explanations. She let out an impatient huff, shaking her head as though she had no time for such nonsense. "Excited or not, rules are rules," she muttered under her breath, but just loud enough for Olivia to hear. She turned and stormed away, leaving an awkward silence in her wake. Ethan shrank back into his seat, his once glowing face now dimmed with uncertainty. His small fingers clutched the edge of his mother's sleeve as he whispered, "Did I do something wrong, Mama?" Olivia's heart clenched. "No, sweetheart," she whispered, kissing the top of his head. "You did nothing wrong." But as she spoke, a familiar sting of frustration bubbled up inside her. She had seen that kind of dismissal before. That cold, clipped tone. She knew what it meant. Unbeknownst to Teresa, the entire exchange had been witnessed from a few rows ahead. Jackson Reed, a senior airline executive, had been engrossed in his tablet, reviewing company reports, when the sharpness of her voice had pulled him from his concentration. He had spent years in the airline industry, understanding the importance of customer experience, and he had seen interactions like this before, ones that spoke of something deeper than just enforcing safety rules. His gut told him this wasn't just about an overenthusiastic child. There was something in Teresa's tone, the dismissal in her eyes, that set off a quiet alarm inside him. He watched as Olivia comforted her son, her own shoulders squared with quiet dignity, her eyes darting briefly to the other passengers who had witnessed the scene. A few had turned away uncomfortably. Others exchanged glances but said nothing. Jackson had seen enough. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, his tall frame moving with a measured authority as he made his way toward the galley, where Teresa was briskly organizing drinks. She looked up as he approached, her expression momentarily stiffening before she forced a tight smile. "Something I can assist you with, sir?" she asked, her voice all business. "Yes," Jackson said, his voice polite but firm. "I'd like to have a word about what just happened with that young boy and his mother." Teresa blinked, her posture shifting slightly, as if bracing herself. "Is there an issue?" she asked, feigning innocence, but there was a defensive edge to her tone. Jackson didn't flinch. "I believe there is," he replied smoothly. "I understand the importance of enforcing safety protocols. But what I witnessed back there wasn't about rules. It was about how you spoke to them." Teresa's jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "Sir, I was simply doing my job. Passengers need to follow the guidelines." Jackson tilted his head slightly, observing her carefully. "I agree, but enforcing rules and treating passengers with dignity are not mutually exclusive. That child wasn't causing a disruption. He was excited, and instead of guiding him with kindness, you humiliated him." A flicker of uncertainty passed over Teresa's face, but she quickly masked it. "I wasn't trying to be rude," she said stiffly, her fingers gripping the clipboard in her hands. Jackson's expression remained steady. Intentions don't always align with impact. he said, his voice quieter now, but no less commanding. And I have to ask, would your reaction have been the same if it had been a different family? Her breath caught for half a second before she masked it with an indignant huff. I don't know what you're implying, she muttered, but her hands were fidgeting now. The clipboard pressed tighter against her chest. Jackson took a step closer, his tone unwavering. I'm not implying anything. I'm asking you to reflect. The silence that followed was deafening. Teresa swallowed hard, and for the first time since the confrontation, she looked uneasy. Behind them, the quiet murmurs of passengers had started again. The energy in the cabin had shifted, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. The incident hadn't gone unnoticed, and the weight of judgment lingered in every glance thrown in her direction. Jackson took a measured breath and straightened. For now, I'm requesting that you continue your duties without further interaction with that family. He paused, his eyes locking onto hers with quiet authority. We will discuss this further once we land. Teresa opened her mouth, as if to argue, but no words came out. She merely nodded stiffly. Stepping back, Jackson turned and walked back toward his seat, passing Olivia and Ethan. Olivia caught his eye, her expression uncertain, but there was a quiet gratitude in her gaze. Jackson gave a subtle nod, silent assurance that someone had seen, and that someone cared. As he sat back down, he discreetly pulled out his phone, typing out a quick message to his team on the ground. The wheels of accountability had already begun turning. And for Teresa, this was only the beginning of what would be the longest flight of her career. The flight was still in progress, but the air inside the cabin felt heavier, charged with tension that only seemed to grow with every passing second. Passengers had already sensed that something was unfolding, something beyond the usual flight routine. The whispers had started, quiet at first, hushed exchanges between passengers who had witnessed what had happened earlier between Teresa, the flight attendant, and the young boy, Ethan, a mother and her child, publicly humiliated for nothing more than a moment of innocent excitement. And now, as the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, the weight of that moment had not faded. If anything, it had intensified. In first class, Jackson Reed sat with an impassive expression, his fingers lightly tapping against the armrest of his seat as he observed the movement of the crew. He was calm, composed, but inside, his mind was already working through the next steps. He had been in this business long enough to know that moments like this couldn't be ignored. He had already made his decision. A subtle glance toward the galley told him all he needed to know. Teresa was there, standing stiffly, her back pressed against the counter as she busied herself with the drink cart. But there was something different about her now. Gone was the arrogance, the thinly veiled contempt she had displayed when speaking to Olivia and Ethan. Instead, her hands trembled slightly as she poured a drink for a passenger in first class. Her movements less steady, her usual sharpness dulled by something new, fear. She could feel it, the judgment, the scrutiny, the realization that she had gone too far. But it was too late. She flinched slightly when another flight attendant, Rachel, approached her. Rachel hesitated before speaking, choosing her words carefully. The captain wants to see you, she said, her voice neutral, but the underlying urgency was impossible to miss. Teresa's grip tightened around the glass she had been holding. What for? She asked, though she already knew. Rachel didn't answer right away. Instead, she simply met Teresa's gaze with something that almost looked like pity. Just go, she said softly. Teresa swallowed hard. She straightened her uniform, took a deep breath, and walked toward the front of the plane, where the cockpit and the senior crew station were located. Each step felt heavier than the last, the murmurs of passengers following her like a shadow. By now, they all knew. She pushed through the curtain leading to the front galley and found herself face to face with the captain, a stern-looking man in his early 50s who had been flying for decades. Next to him stood Jackson Reed, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. Teresa's pulse quickened. The captain wasted no time. Teresa, we need to talk, he said, his voice calm but edged with authority. We've received a formal complaint about your behavior toward a passenger, and I've been briefed on the situation. Teresa opened her mouth to protest, to insist that she had only been following the rules, that she hadn't meant for things to escalate, but before she could say anything, Jackson spoke. You crossed a line, he said, his voice level but firm. Your job is to enforce safety protocols. Yes, but it's also to ensure passengers feel respected and valued. What you did back there wasn't just enforcing a rule, it was humiliating a mother and her child in front of an entire cabin. Teresa's face burned. I didn't mean. It doesn't matter what you meant. Jackson interrupted, his voice sharp now. It matters what you did. And the impact it had. The captain exhaled heavily, rubbing his temple. We can't ignore this, Teresa. We have procedures in place for handling situations like these. And effective immediately. You're being removed from duty for the remainder of this flight. Teresa's stomach dropped. What? Jackson's gaze didn't waver. Once we land, you'll be escorted off the aircraft by security and HR representatives who are waiting at the gate. We'll be conducting a full investigation. And until further notice, you are suspended from all flight duties. Teresa felt the walls closing in around her. This couldn't be happening. She had worked for this airline for years. Dedicated long shifts. Given up personal time for this job. She had seniority, she had power. And now, it was all slipping through her fingers. This is a misunderstanding. She tried again, her voice cracking. I was just trying to do my job. Jackson's expression remained unmoved. No, Teresa, he said simply. Your job was to serve the passengers, not belittle them. Silence filled the space between them, thick with finality. The captain sighed. Take a seat in the jump seat at the front galley. Do not engage with passengers. Do not return to service. Teresa knew there was no arguing. No way to salvage this, not now. She nodded stiffly and turned away, her vision blurring as she walked back to the front galley, where she sank into the jump seat and stared at the floor. She had never felt smaller. Back in the main cabin, Olivia was doing her best to keep Ethan distracted. She had seen Teresa disappear toward the front of the plane and had caught the cautious looks exchanged between the crew. Something was happening, something big. She didn't know exactly what it was, but she could feel it. A man seated across the aisle leaned toward her. His voice hushed. I think they're handling it, he murmured, offering her a reassuring nod. Olivia managed a small smile, but she wasn't sure how she felt. It was a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. She had never wanted this trip to start with conflict, but after what had happened, she had no choice but to stand firm. For herself and for her son. The intercom chimed. The captain's voice came through, steady and controlled. Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for our final descent, I'd like to thank you for flying with us today. We want to ensure every passenger has a comfortable and respectful experience. And I want to personally acknowledge any concerns that may have arisen during this flight. We take these matters seriously and are addressing them accordingly. The captain's words weren't direct, but they were clear enough. The passengers knew what he was talking about. Teresa's fate was sealed. The wheels of the plane met the runway with a smooth, practiced touch, and the cabin filled with the usual sounds of landing, the click of seatbelts unfastening, the rustle of passengers reaching for their bags, the quiet excitement of people preparing to disembark. But there was something else in the air now, something unspoken, something tense. The flight attendants who remained in service stood at their designated spots, their smiles strained but professional. Rachel avoided looking toward the front galley, where Teresa remained seated, her face pale and her hands gripping the edge of her uniform. As the doors opened and passengers began to file out, those seated near the front caught a glimpse of the scene unfolding just outside the aircraft. 2 security personnel stood at the gate, their expressions impassive. Next to them was a woman in a navy blue suit, a representative from the airline's HR department. The message was clear. As Olivia and Ethan stepped off the plane, she couldn't help but look back just in time to see Teresa being called forward. The former flight attendant moved stiffly, her head held high, but Olivia could see the truth in her eyes. Defeat. As passengers passed by, some watching, some pretending not to, Teresa walked toward the HR representative, her future with the airline hanging in the balance. Olivia exhaled, tightening her grip on Ethan's hand. She had never wanted to be the reason someone lost their job. But she also knew one thing for certain. Respect should never be optional. And today, someone had finally learned that lesson the hard way. The moment the plane touched down, the story was far from over. Passengers gathered their belongings, some stretching after the long flight, others glancing around, their eyes flickering toward the front of the cabin where Teresa had been forced to remain in the jump seat. Silent and unmoving, No one spoke to her. No one offered words of encouragement. It was as though she had been erased before she even left the aircraft. Olivia gathered Ethan's small backpack, slinging it over her shoulder before taking his hand. She could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her, the stress of what had happened lingering like an unwelcome shadow. But she also felt something else, validation. For once, someone had listened, someone had believed her. As they stepped into the terminal, the usual airport chaos surrounded them, passengers weaving through crowds, announcements blaring over the intercom, the low hum of luggage wheels rolling across the floor. But Olivia barely noticed. What she did notice was the group of airline representatives gathered near the gate. Security personnel stood beside a professionally dressed woman, clearly someone from Human Resources. And in the center of it all, Teresa. Olivia paused, instinctively tightening her grip on Ethan's hand. Teresa, standing with her arms crossed, her face stiff with unreadable emotion, looked nothing like the commanding presence she had been on the flight. She was smaller now, diminished, and, Olivia realized, afraid. For a brief second, their eyes met. Teresa's lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something, maybe an apology, maybe a defense, or maybe nothing at all. But whatever it was, the moment passed. The HR representative spoke to her in hushed tones, and Teresa was escorted away through a side door, disappearing into the inner corridors of the airport where the fate of her career would be decided. Olivia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was over, at least for her. But for Teresa, the reckoning had only just begun. The aftermath, a tipping point for the airline. The formal complaint filed against Teresa reached the airline's corporate offices before the flight had even landed. James Reed had ensured that, the moment he sent his message to the executive team, the wheels were already in motion. By the time he arrived at the corporate headquarters the next morning, the topic had already become one of the most pressing matters on the executive board's agenda. James sat at the long, sleek conference table, his expression unreadable as the CEO, Richard Hale, flipped through the printed incident report. Across from them sat the head of the legal team, and a few high-ranking managers. "So, let me get this straight." Richard finally spoke, his tone clipped. A senior flight attendant publicly humiliated a passenger and a child in front of an entire cabin. And this isn't even her first complaint? James kept his voice steady. "That's correct." Murmurs of discontent rippled through the room. The head of Evelyn Carter, leaned forward, adjusting her glasses. "We did a preliminary review of Teresa's record. While she hasn't had an official disciplinary action before, there have been multiple reports of rigid behavior, excessive strictness with passengers, complaints of rudeness, dismissiveness toward certain customers." She sighed, "but nothing that escalated to this level." James interlaced his fingers. "Until now." Silence settled over the table. Richard exhaled sharply. "We have two problems," he said. "1. We need to take immediate action to address this incident. 2. We need to make sure this never happens again." The legal team exchanged glances. One of the lawyers, a middle-aged woman named Diane, spoke next. "We can terminate Teresa immediately for misconduct. But we also need to be prepared for a potential backlash. If she decides to fight it, we need to be airtight on our reasoning." Evelyn pursed her lips. "And what about the passengers? What do we say to them?" James straightened. "We own it," he said simply. "We issue a formal apology to Olivia Carter and her son. We offer compensation, not because we're legally required to, but because it's the right thing to do." Richard nodded. "And beyond that?" James met his gaze. "We overhaul our training programs. We introduce mandatory bias and sensitivity training for all flight attendants. We make it clear that this isn't just about rules and regulations, it's about human decency." The CEO studied him for a long moment. Then, he nodded. "Do it." And just like that, the airline's course had been set. Teresa's realization, a life unraveling. Teresa sat in the cold, impersonal office of the HR department, her hands gripping the arms of her chair so tightly that her nails dug into the fabric. The walls were lined with plaques and framed company achievements, reminders of the institution she had been part of for over 15 years. She had given everything to this airline. And now, she was watching it all slip through her fingers. Evelyn Carter sat across from her, the disciplinary file open on the table. She was calm, professional, But Teresa could feel the weight of judgment in the air. "You've been placed on indefinite suspension. Effective immediately," Evelyn said. "We will be conducting a full investigation. But based on the preliminary findings, your future with the airline is uncertain." Teresa's throat tightened. "I was just trying to do my job." Evelyn exhaled. "No, Teresa. You were trying to assert control. And you did it at the expense of a passenger who had done nothing wrong." A lump formed in Teresa's throat. "I didn't mean to." Intentions don't change impact. The words hit Teresa harder than she expected. She had spent her entire career believing that authority was what made her respected. That enforcing the rules without compromise was what made her good at her job. But now, sitting in this office, stripped of the uniform that once gave her power, she realized the truth. She hadn't been respected. She had been feared. And that fear had just cost her everything. Evelyn closed the folder. "I suggest you take this time to reflect," she said, her tone softer now, "because whatever happens next will depend on what you do with it." For the first time in years, Teresa didn't have an answer. An apology, but is it enough? A few days later, Olivia received an email from the airline. It was formal, carefully worded, but there was a genuine sincerity beneath the corporate language. "Dear Ms. Carter, on behalf of our airline, we extend our deepest apologies for the distressing experience you and your son endured on your recent flight. Ensuring a safe and welcoming environment for all passengers is our highest priority. And we deeply regret that our employee failed to uphold this standard." The email went on to confirm that Teresa had been suspended and that a full investigation was underway. As a gesture of goodwill, the airline had credited Olivia's account with 50,000 reward miles and offered a direct line to a customer relations executive should she wish to discuss the matter further. It was something. But Olivia didn't know if it was enough. She read the email twice, then turned to Ethan, who was sitting on the floor drawing airplanes in his sketchbook. His innocence, his ability to move past what had happened, was both comforting and heartbreaking. She closed her laptop. Maybe change had to start somewhere. The beginning of something new. As James pushed forward with the airline's new sensitivity training, he found himself receiving an unexpected email. It was from Teresa. "Mr. Reed, I know you don't owe me anything, but I want you to know that I've been reflecting on my actions. I understand now that I was wrong. I don't expect forgiveness, but if there's any way I can contribute to the changes you're making, I'd like to try." James read the email twice before leaning back in his chair. People could change, but they had to choose to. For Olivia, for Ethan, and for every passenger who had ever been treated unfairly. This was just the start. Because respect should never be optional. And this time, someone had finally learned that lesson. Nancy sat in her small apartment, staring at the blank notepad in front of her. The silence was overwhelming, pressing down on her like a weight she could not shake. It had been weeks since her suspension, and every day that passed only deepened the realization of what she had lost. Not just her job, not just her routine, she had lost something more profound, her identity. For years, she had worn her uniform with pride, believing it set her apart as a professional, a leader among the crew, someone who demanded respect. But now, that same uniform hung in the corner of her closet, untouched, like a relic of a past self she no longer recognized. The headlines had spread across industry forums. "Flight attendant's harsh words lead to drastic consequences." Her name had been omitted. But she knew. Everyone who had been on that flight knew. She had spent her life commanding respect. But now, when she walked into a room, she felt something she had never felt before: shame. Nancy had always convinced herself that she was just enforcing the rules. That passengers needed to be kept in check for safety. That a strict hand ensured order. But was that really the truth? Had she been enforcing rules, or had she been punishing people for stepping outside the boundaries of what she deemed acceptable? Her mind replayed the moment over and over again. The child's face. His wide eyes filled with confusion. The mother's protective posture. Her calm yet firm voice. The other passengers, their discomfort evident. And then, James Reed, the executive in first class who had stood up for them when no one else had. The man whose quiet authority had dismantled everything she thought she knew about her role. She had spent the first few days after the incident defending herself in her mind. "I was just doing my job. The rules matter. I didn't mean anything by it." But those excuses rang hollow now. Because deep down, She knew that wasn't the whole truth. She had let herself become hardened. She had let exhaustion turn into bitterness. Let stress morph into resentment. Let the weight of her responsibilities turn into an excuse to wield power instead of compassion. And in doing so, she had lost sight of what it meant to truly serve. Nancy reached for her phone, her fingers hesitating before she searched for local workshops. She didn't know what she was looking for, only that she needed to understand, truly understand, where she had gone wrong. The road to redemption. The first workshop was unbearable. She sat in a circle of strangers, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as the facilitator spoke about bias, how it forms, how it seeps into decisions without people even realizing it. They talked about microaggressions, about power dynamics, about the responsibility of those in authority to use their influence for good. And then came the moment that hit her the hardest. A young woman shared a story about an experience she had on a flight years ago. She had been traveling alone for the first time and had been treated with coldness and suspicion by a flight attendant simply because she didn't look like she belonged in first class. She didn't say anything outright cruel, the woman said, her voice steady but tinged with old hurt. But the way she looked at me, the way she dismissed me, the way she treated other passengers with warmth but spoke to me like I was a problem, it made me feel small. Like I didn't deserve to be there. Nancy felt her stomach twist. She had done that, hadn't she? Not just to Olivia, but to others. She had never used slurs, never raised her voice in outright aggression, but she had wielded her authority in a way that made people feel unwelcome, unworthy, and that was just as damaging. For the first time in a long time, Nancy felt tears sting her eyes. She had always thought of herself as fair, but fairness wasn't just about treating everyone the same. It was about recognizing when people weren't starting from the same place. It was about ensuring that dignity was never a privilege, but a right. By the end of the session, Nancy knew one thing for certain: if she ever got another chance, she wouldn't be the same person who had walked onto that plane. A company's transformation. While Nancy faced the reality of her actions, James Reed was leading a transformation within the airline. The company could have treated the incident as an isolated problem, fired Nancy, issued a generic apology, and moved on. But James wasn't interested in temporary fixes. He wanted change that mattered. He pushed for a full review of training policies. Sensitivity training wasn't enough, it had to be immersive. Employees needed to understand the experiences of passengers from all walks of life. A new passenger advocacy program was introduced, ensuring that complaints were handled not just with efficiency, but with empathy. Flight attendants were required to go through real-world scenario training, where they would step into the shoes of passengers facing discrimination, bias, or unfair treatment. Accountability structures were reinforced. Incidents like the one on Olivia's flight wouldn't just be reported, they would be addressed, tracked, and used to prevent future occurrences. James was determined that no passenger would ever have to wonder whether their voice mattered, and no employee would be able to hide behind authority as an excuse for cruelty. Moving forward. Meanwhile, Olivia chose to move forward. She could have held on to anger. She could have demanded more from the airline, fought for Teresa's permanent termination, insisted on greater compensation, but none of that would have erased what happened. Instead, she focused on her son, on his excitement for their trip, on the way his small hand fit so perfectly in hers as they walked along the shoreline. Collecting seashells, she watched as he played, as he laughed, and she let go of the weight she had been carrying. Because for Olivia, justice wasn't just about consequences, it was about change. And from what she could see, change was happening. One last chance. Weeks passed before Nancy received an email from the airline. She had been expecting her official termination notice. Instead, the subject line read, "A second chance." Her breath caught as she read the message. "Dear Ms. Smith, after reviewing your case, we have decided to offer you an opportunity to participate in our new training initiative. While your role as a flight attendant remains suspended, we believe your experiences can serve as a powerful lesson in our training programs. If you are willing to engage in this process, we would like to invite you to join our next workshop as a guest speaker." Nancy sat frozen, rereading the words over and over. She wasn't being welcomed back. Not yet. But they weren't discarding her, either. They were giving her a choice: to fade away in disgrace, or to turn her failure into something meaningful. She swallowed hard and typed her response. I accept. The final lesson. A month later, Nancy stood at the front of a training room filled with airline employees. She had never felt more exposed. Taking a deep breath, she looked out at the expectant faces. I was a senior flight attendant for 15 years. She began, her voice steady, and for most of that time, I thought I was one of the best. She let the words sink in before continuing. But I made a terrible mistake. I treated a mother and her child with coldness instead of kindness. I used my authority to dismiss instead of to help. And in doing so, I failed, not just as a flight attendant, but as a person. She swallowed. I stand here today because I want you to understand something. The power we hold in our roles is real. We decide whether a passenger feels safe, welcomed, valued, and we have a choice, every single day, to use that power for good. The room was silent, and for the first time, Nancy didn't feel like she was clinging to control. She felt free. A call to action. If you believe in the power of change, in the strength of owning mistakes and growing from them, then let this be a reminder that we all have a role to play in making the world a better place. Hit like if you support holding people accountable while also giving them the chance to grow. Comment below. Do you think Nancy deserved a second chance? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the power of redemption. The months following the incident on Flight 287 proved to be a turning point not only for those directly involved but for the entire airline industry. What had started as a moment of conflict and injustice evolved into something greater, a movement toward change, accountability, and a renewed commitment to fairness. While the road to transformation was not without challenges, it was a journey that redefined the lives of Sophia, Daniel, Nancy, and even James Reed. A shift in the industry. One of the first major changes came from within the airline itself. Under James Reed's leadership, a mandatory bias and sensitivity training program was implemented for all employees, not just flight attendants but pilots, customer service agents, and even executives. The program was designed to do more than simply teach policies. It was created to shift perspectives, foster empathy, and challenge unconscious bias in the workplace. During training sessions, employees were placed in real-life scenarios that mirrored actual incidents reported by passengers. They were asked to step into the shoes of travelers from all backgrounds, experiencing firsthand how a simple action, a dismissive tone, an assumption, or a lack of compassion could impact someone's journey. The goal was not just to correct behavior but to cultivate an environment where respect was not just expected but deeply ingrained in the culture of service. James knew that change couldn't stop at his airline. He reached out to other industry leaders, encouraging them to adopt similar policies. At first, there was resistance. Some executives viewed it as unnecessary, an overreaction to a single event. But as the story continued to circulate, gaining traction in media outlets and social discussions, the pressure for accountability grew. Soon, other airlines followed suit, launching their own programs and pledging to take passenger complaints more seriously. The industry had been forced to acknowledge a truth it had long ignored, that bias, whether intentional or not, had no place in a service designed to be inclusive for all. Nancy's redemption. For Nancy, the aftermath of that flight was one of the most difficult periods of her life. She had spent years believing she was a professional, respected in her role. To suddenly be stripped of that identity left her feeling adrift. She could have disappeared into bitterness, blaming the system or those who had called out her behavior. But instead, she chose a different path. When she received an email inviting her to participate in the airline's new training program, not as a flight attendant, but as a guest speaker sharing her story, she hesitated. The idea of standing in front of her former colleagues and admitting her mistakes was terrifying. But deep down, she knew that if she truly wanted to grow, she had to face her past head-on. Her first session was nerve-wracking. Standing before a room full of airline employees, she felt exposed, vulnerable. But as she spoke, recounting the incident, the assumptions she had made, and the realization of her own biases, she saw the expressions in the room shift. Some looked uncomfortable, others contemplative, but no one dismissed her words. "I never thought of myself as a bad person," she admitted. "I thought I was doing my job. But I learned the hard way that just following the rules isn't an excuse for treating people without respect. It's our responsibility to be better than that." After the session, employees approached her, some thanking her for her honesty, others admitting they had made similar mistakes without realizing it. In the months that followed, Nancy continued to speak at sessions, slowly rebuilding her sense of purpose. She would never return as a flight attendant. That chapter of her life had closed. But in her new role as an advocate for change, she found something just as valuable: the ability to help others grow before they made the same mistakes she had. A new beginning for Sophia and Daniel. For Sophia, the months following the flight were a mix of emotions. While she was relieved that action had been taken, the experience had left a lasting imprint on her. She had always known that discrimination existed, but experiencing it firsthand, seeing her son's excitement turn to confusion and sadness, was something she could never forget. She had received a personal apology from the airline, along with an assurance that their new policies were already making a difference. But words only meant so much. Would things really change? Would the next family who looked like hers be treated with dignity? There was only one way to find out. Months later, she and Daniel boarded another flight, this time for a holiday trip. As they took their seats, Sophia felt a quiet apprehension in her chest. Would history repeat itself? Would she have to defend her son again? But something was different. From the moment they stepped onto the plane, the flight crew was attentive, warm, and respectful. A young flight attendant stopped by Daniel's seat, offering him a pair of pilot wings to pin to his shirt. "For our junior flyer," she said with a smile. "Are you excited for your trip?" Daniel grinned, nodding eagerly. Sophia exhaled, a tension she hadn't realized she was holding finally releasing. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. As the plane soared through the sky, she glanced at her son, who was busy looking out the window, his excitement fully restored. In that moment, she knew the world wasn't perfect, but it could change. And when people stood up, spoke out, and demanded better, change did happen. The power of taking a stand. This story isn't just about one flight, one confrontation, or one employee facing consequences. It's about the bigger picture, the importance of accountability, self-reflection, and the willingness to change. Sophia could have stayed silent, but she didn't, and because she spoke up, the airline was forced to confront its shortcomings. Nancy could have blamed others, but she didn't. She faced her mistakes, learned from them, and used them to help others grow. James could have handled it quietly, treating it as a minor incident, but he saw the bigger issue and took steps to ensure systemic change. And the airline could have ignored it, issuing a half-hearted apology and moving on. But instead, they committed to lasting transformation, setting an example for the entire industry. The lesson here? Every action we take matters. Every choice we make has a ripple effect. When we choose to stand up for what is right, when we hold ourselves and others accountable, when we acknowledge our mistakes and commit to doing better, we contribute to a world that is more fair, more just, and more compassionate. Your voice matters. What do you think about Nancy's redemption? Do you believe people deserve second chances? Have you ever experienced or witnessed an injustice that needed to be addressed? We want to hear from you. Comment below with your thoughts and experiences. Your voice matters, and your perspective can inspire others to take a stand in their own lives. And if you believe in stories that challenge, inspire, and push for change, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. By supporting these conversations, you help ensure that more people see them, more voices are heard, and more positive change happens. Thank you for watching. And remember, even the smallest action can create waves of justice.